Welcome to ACP. I'm your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments of the most critical issues. Whether you're new to the topic or need a refresher, I hope you will join us in our exploration of everything related to arms control. In this season, we offer primers on all the nuclear weapons arsenals currently existing in the world and their relationship to arms control. I hope it helps you better know a nuke.
Meir guaranteed that Israel would not test, declare, or threaten its neighbors with nuclear weapons. Nixon agreed to remove the issue from the bilateral agenda, meaning that Israel would not be pressured to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Unlike other nuclear-armed states, Israel does not officially acknowledge its arsenal. This episode explores the history, strategy, and arms control implications of Israel's nuclear program. Let's get to better know a hidden nuke.
My name is Or Rabinowitz. I'm from the Hebrew University, a tenured senior lecturer at the International Relations Department. Currently, I took a year of unpaid leave, and I'm at Stanford University, where I'm a visiting associate professor of Israel studies for this academic year. I study nuclear proliferation, intelligence, Israel-US relations, and related issues. There are many interesting things about Israel's nuclear program. One of them that is striking is that it's the only country that started thinking about nuclear development before it was a country. After the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, Chaim Weizmann was one of the leading figures of the Zionist movement at the time, albeit already in decline. He was already replaced by David Ben-Gurion. He was a chemist, and he had a good grasp of the scientific background of what was needed for that. And 2 weeks after Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, he already corresponded with some of his close confidants. And based on those letters, we know that he was quite intrigued by the phenomena of the atom bomb or by nuclear weapons. The correspondence already shows us that he was thinking about the fact that many Jewish scientists were involved in the Manhattan Project could further the Zionist cause. He actually went to Albert Einstein, the preeminent physicist of the time, and he proposed to Einstein to give a speech. So the speech that Weizmann was thinking about was the keynote speech Einstein was supposed to deliver at the Nobel dinner that winter. And Weizmann sends Einstein a draft. We have the draft. It's both in the Weizmann archive and in the Einstein archive. The draft proposes Einstein to say that Jewish scientists delivered the atom bomb to the democracies in their fight against the Nazis and the Japanese. And in return, they should work to make sure that the Jewish refugees and Holocaust survivors would be able to go to Palestine. So basically pressure the British, who are then controlling Palestine. It was British-controlled Palestine. Pressure the British to open the gate for Palestine and allow Holocaust survivors in. We don't know how Einstein responded because we don't have correspondence. Maybe they didn't speak at all. Maybe they spoke on the phone. Maybe there's a letter that got lost and was never archived. But we do know what he ended up saying in the speech, because that was actually recorded and it became a very important speech. He uses some of the proposed language, but not all of it. He does call on democracies to allow Holocaust survivors to immigrate to Palestine, but he disconnects this from the issue of the contribution of Jewish scientists to the Manhattan Project. And he refers to it as scientists, we the physicists, we the scientists brought about this development. So obviously, he thought that it was a bad idea to emphasize the contribution of Jewish scientists to the Manhattan Project. If we move forward, we know that in November 1947, Weizmann was also toying with the idea of maybe establishing a nuclear reactor in British-controlled Palestine before the State of Israel was established, but nothing substantial took place there. And in May 1948, the State of Israel was established, and control of this issue was basically transferred to David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, and he moved relatively quickly in this sphere. A few months after Israel was established, 6 promising scientists are sent to study nuclear physics abroad. In the early 50s, Israel established the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission and signed contract to build 2 different reactors in Israel. One of them is a small research reactor that Israel got from the Americans as a part of the Atoms for Peace plan. The second one was the French reactor built near the town of Dimona. That was a secret reactor. Israel was building it without informing the world that it was building it, and it was exposed internationally by leaks to the American press in December 1960, and then the Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion acknowledged it in a speech. So it was never really a secret that Israel was building a reactor, and later on it operated it, but Israel never acknowledged what it was doing inside the reactor. Throughout the 1960s, Israel was building its nuclear capability. Around late 63 or early 64, Israel probably started producing plutonium as a reactor, but this isn't something the Israeli government officially acknowledged. From what we know, because Israel has never officially acknowledged a big part of its nuclear history, we work with secondary sources or primary sources that are not Israelis. For example, we can work with American and British and Canadian and other intelligence estimates. We can work with leaks. We can work with some unidentified comments made by people close to the program. But the important thing to understand is that we're not talking about official statements. But using these sources, we can draw a preliminary history of the Israeli nuclear program. From what we know, Israeli nuclear forces were put on alert on 3 different instances. In the days leading to the 67 war, Israel already put 2, maybe more, primitive nuclear devices in state of readiness. The idea was that the leadership may ask the IDF to detonate a demonstrative nuclear device in the desert. This wasn't a military deployment. This wasn't a deployable device. It wasn't a bomb that you can drop from a plane or put on a missile. This was a very big device, the size of a fridge or 2. The idea was that the Air Force would take it and deploy it on a hilltop in Sinai, attach a timer to it, run away, basically hide. The team was supposed to hide. And this would demonstrate the capability, but wouldn't target battlefield targets. But obviously, this wasn't something that was ever conducted. In 1973, Israel was already nuclear capable and put on alert a squadron of Israeli Air Force jets. We believe they were Mirage jets. We think that at least twice during the war, the forces were put on alert. But it's not clear to us what kind of alert it was and who exactly was behind it. In September 2023, a few days before October 7th, an interesting news story appeared in Israeli news by journalist Ronen Bergman, who was working with historian Adam Raz. They published a bunch of handwritten notes that Adam Raz, the historian, had come across. We can't verify the sources, but they seem to have the handwriting of Israeli officials at the time, and ministers of the cabinet, describe relevant incidences. Based on these notes, at least twice, Israel's nuclear forces were put on alert, but not necessarily with the Prime Minister's authorization, Prime Minister Golda Meir. According to the note, she actually ordered Dayan, the Minister of Defense, to remove the alert. And if I'm quoting the note accurately, she said something like, "The party is over." We think that there was some sort of an alert and that it probably involved bombs that Israel could have deployed using its Air Force. Israel's missiles were not yet deployable using some leaks and secondary sources. The picture is not completely clear. Israel displayed the missiles to deter the Egyptians and the Soviets, almost a blast in the sense that the missiles were not yet deployable. They could not have carried a nuclear warhead at the time, but the Egyptians and the Soviets had no way of knowing this. This is how we see the deployment of the Jericho missiles during the 1973 war. We don't have official documentation. Another important event, which is a part of Israel's nuclear history, is an incident called the Villa Incident from September 1979. This is a suspected nuclear test, and the suspects of conducting it are Israel and South Africa. Most scholars believe that they probably somehow collaborated in conducting this test, but we don't know exactly how this assumed collaboration went on. In the 1960s, Israel guaranteed the U.S. that it would not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East. And in 1969, this became an official policy. Israelis from then on basically stated this and doubled down to this outwardly, and this was Israel's official nuclear policy, that Israel would not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the region. Introduction isn't actually a legal term, but what it was understood by the United States and what the Israelis understood it to be was first and foremost an Israeli guarantee not to conduct a nuclear test, because introduction was seen as possibly many things, but for sure a nuclear test was seen as an introduction. In the mid-1970s, Israel started to collaborate with South Africa, then under the apartheid regime. Both countries were basically pariah states, were the target of boycotts by different parts of the world. They started to collaborate against that backdrop, and South Africa was also developing its own nuclear weapons program. Like Israel, it was a clandestine, a secret nuclear weapons program. We don't know exactly the terms of the collaboration or the depth of the assistance. We have some assumptions about this assistance in the mid-70s onward. But what we think is that the Villa incident was tied to this. Now that we understand the backdrop, what exactly was the Villa incident? In September 1979, the night of the 20th or the 21st, depending on which time zone you inhabit, an American spy satellite from the Villa series, this is why we call it the Villa incident, picked up a signal above the Indian Ocean, roughly halfway between Cape Town and the southern tip, if you will, of Antarctica. Somewhere in the middle of the ocean, our Villa satellite picks up a signal, and that signal is very interesting. It had the shape of a double hump. If we conjure up the image of a camel with two humps, we'll understand that the signal was somewhat similar to that. It's an interesting signal because the only other phenomena that actually gives out this signal is a nuclear test. The Carter administration and President Carter himself were now in a bind. We have this signal. It could either indicate a nuclear test or something else. But if it is a nuclear test, we have to attribute it to someone. And now we have a problem. We should all know that President Carter himself was trained in nuclear physics. He served in the U.S. Navy. He knew what he was talking about. Carter wrote in his diary that this could either be an Israeli test, a South African test, or neither. What we think happened as scholars is that the review panel, or basically the bureaucrats and the scientists that the Carter administration tapped to figure out whether this was a test or not, we think that it was basically set up for them to conclude that it was not a nuclear test. That panel specifically didn't include intelligence people. These people didn't actually get to read intelligence assessments. And at the end, they basically said, we're not sure what it was. Maybe a nuclear test, maybe something, they call it a zoo event, maybe like an atmospheric event where basically light bounces off the ocean and the clouds. So no official finding was reached. And when you don't have an official finding, you don't have to say who you suspect it was. But the understanding in the academic community was that this is most likely a nuclear test. The suspects are Israel and South Africa. And the scholarly community basically believes that it was probably the product of some sort of a collaboration. Perhaps the South Africans were doing it with either Israeli assistance or the Israelis observing it because the Israeli guaranteed the U.S. that they would not introduce nuclear weapons, and many scholars believe that they were probably not conducting a nuclear test by themselves, maybe just observing it or somehow collaborating. It's a bit of an ongoing mystery. We didn't have South African sources or Israeli sources coming out either officially, unofficially, by leaks to the press, by secret interviews and such, saying, I was there, I witnessed the test, I saw it. We have secondary hand sources. For example, there was a South African convicted spy who spied from within the South African establishment for the Soviets, and he said, I knew they were up to something. I saw 3 ships, one of them Israeli, one of them South African, leaving a naval base. There are some circumstantial evidence, but we don't have anyone from the inner circle saying, yes, this was a South African or an Israeli or a joint nuclear test. We don't have an official smoking gun. Ideally, you'd like one Israeli, one South African, of course, even more. That we don't have. In the literature, there is a book by scholar Richard Rhodes who cites a source. It seems to be Israeli following the content, but it doesn't say this is an Israeli source, saying that he was involved and this was a part of an Israeli-South African nuclear test. The assumption was that that specific location was chosen because it would have been, in theory, easy to get away with it. Literally in the middle of nowhere. That specific Villa satellite that did end up picking the signal was supposed to be out of commission. It was too old. It was decades old. Interestingly enough, that specific satellite had identified 100% of its identifications correctly. So we're talking about dozens of tests. I forget the exact number, but scores of nuclear tests. That specific satellite correctly identified them. It was supposed to be out of commission. It wasn't taken out of commission. So the understanding is that, assuming this were some sort of a collaborative Israeli-South African effort, that they were under the impression that it would not be detected. And I should also stress that it was a low-yield test. We're not talking about a big nuclear test. We're talking about something that was probably rather small. But the one interesting thing that happened was the 1986 Vanunu scandal, or the Vanunu revelation. Mordechai Vanunu was a technician at Israel's secret Dimona reactor. He became disillusioned with Israel and the reactor. He quit his job. He went traveling, and one thing led to another, and the London Sunday Times published a story based on Vanunu testimonies about what was happening. Before Vanunu quit his job, he actually smuggled in a camera and took photos inside the complex itself. So any semblance of mystery or ambiguity about what was actually happening in Iran basically blew away in October 1986. Ever since, it became a diplomatic vestige of ambiguity, an empty shell of a secret that photographs of inside the reactor were already printed in the press. One of the interesting findings I find my research was that from 1986 onwards, when the U.S. talked with other interlocutors, whether it's the Soviets/Russians, whether it's the Brits, whether it's within the IAEA, and they want to talk about nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, Israel appears from that point on as the first talking point. The U.S. is concerned with Israel's nuclear program. For this reason, we don't conduct civilian nuclear exchanges with the Israelis because Israel refuses to place all its nuclear facilities under safeguard. From that point on, this became really something the U.S. couldn't ignore any longer. The third incident took place during the first Gulf War in January 1991. That summer, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the U.S. had put together a U.S.-led coalition to force the Iraqis to leave Kuwait. And it started with an air campaign, and then the Americans invaded on the ground. When the air campaign started, the Iraqis launched missiles in Israel and Saudi Arabia. The Iraqi motivation was that if you force Israel to retaliate, then the Arabs would leave the US-led campaign because they couldn't bear such strategic proximity to Israel. During that war, Israel did not retaliate. During the war, the Israeli citizens were the target of 39 Scads or Al-Hussein Nishan. There were relatively very few casualties. The body count was low. And it allowed Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir to not retaliate against Iraq of the Scad. In Washington, this was called Scad Thursday. In Israel, it was already Friday morning, so no one called it Scad Thursday. In the first night of the Scad, many American sources like Colin Powell and other people noted that we saw Israel had put its Jericho missiles on land, and they all say, who knows what warhead they had on it. We believe this was a nuclear readiness. If you are a nuclear capable country and you sustain a barrage of missiles, and if you don't know yet if they're chemical or conventional, it's likely that you will put your forces on alert.
The United States played a major role in shaping Israel's refusal to officially acknowledge its nuclear weapons arsenal.
One of the most interesting developments for the Israeli nuclear program was the September 1969 Nixon-Meir deal, which is a secret understanding reached between U.S. President Richard Nixon and Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir during Meir's visit in September 1961 to the White House. So formally never acknowledged. There's extensive scholarly writing on it. Shlomo Ben Ami, former foreign minister of Israel, referred to it in an academic paper he gave in 2009. So it's actually quite substantiated. And there are secondary documents substantiating its existence in American archives and other. According to what we know, this was a relatively basic, simple understanding. Meir guaranteed Israel would not test, declare, or threaten its neighbors with nuclear weapons. Nixon agreed to remove the issue from the bilateral agenda, meaning that Israel would not be pressured to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This understanding was secret until November 91. After the Madrid Peace Conference, Israeli leadership leaked the deal, and it was published by an Israeli journalist with the approval of the Israeli Military Center. They struck down previous stories deemed too sensitive for Israeli national security. In November 91, the story is published, and government sources in the story by Aluf Ben in Israeli newspaper Haaretz say they're concerned the Bush administration will withdraw from the Nixon-Meir deal. So basically, they're trying to make sure that the deal is legitimized, or at least public knowledge. The Israelis were afraid President Bush and Secretary of State Jim Baker would put together a sweeping Middle Eastern initiative, which would also have a nuclear component to basically push Israel to either join the NPT or accept limitations on its nuclear program. In the Madrid Peace Conference in late October and early November, obviously in Madrid, with Israel's participation and participation of the Arab world, they found some basis for the concern. One of the groups that was established was a group dealing with arms control and disarmament and regional security, and the Israelis were afraid that this would be a vehicle to pressure Israel. In my opinion, that's a very big contributing factor to why the deal was kept secret until November 91, and then in November 91 became public knowledge. After the Madrid peace process took place, the Israelis adopted a wary approach to the Americans. They weren't sure what the Americans were planning. On one hand, if President Bush had won a second presidency, they were wary that he may, and I'm quoting from news press at the time, come after Dimona. This was a real concern that Israeli officials had put on the record in the media. But when Clinton won, they didn't know what to expect. Clinton was the former governor of Arkansas. He had zero foreign policy experience, zero history with Israel, and they really did not know what to expect. What happened was that Clinton was swept away in the Israeli-Arab peace process, the Oslo Peace Accord between Israel and the PLO, and became heavily invested in that. The issue of Israel's nuclear program was squared away, much to Israel's relief. According to press reports of the time, Clinton and Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Dr Rabin, agreed that as long as Israel continues to pursue the peace process, the issue of pushing Israel to join the NPT would be secondary, would not be pursued. And indeed, in 1995, when the NPT conference met to decide on whether the NPT will be indefinitely extended or not, the issue is sidelined. Clinton manages to pressure the Egyptians, who were very much against it. He manages to pressure the Egyptians not to put sticks in the wheels of the conference, if you will. They do pass a resolution regarding the Middle East, but it's mild. It's something that the Israelis can definitely live with. It doesn't actually name Israel. And the NPT gets extended indefinitely, which is a huge success for the Clinton administration. As the Israeli nuclear program is sidelined, it's basically ensconced somewhere else. And I think that we've been at that place ever since. So there's a lot of diplomatic going on about nuclear proliferation in the Middle East and Israel's nuclear program, but they have always remained below the threshold of the U.S. actually applying pressure on Israel to join the NPT or actually abandoning the Nixon-Meir deal. Sometimes there were different views, and sometimes different U.S. administration talked with Israel, and sometimes they did not. Regardless of the tone, the policy remained. Israel was not pressured to join the NPT. The NPT has enjoyed the indefinite extension, and the issue didn't resurface. Another thing to understand is that during the Clinton administration, as the Cold War came to an end and Saddam Hussein's secret nuclear program was revealed by the inspection team, Israel, under the Rabin government, decided to make a few changes to its nuclear policy. So they decided to adopt a policy of limited disclosure. They were more open now about the policy itself. For example, Foreign Minister Shimon Peres and official Don Frank, who was then the head of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, they actually gave speeches where they outlined the policy. And they said, this is Israel's nuclear policy, and it's actually quite simple. Israel will agree to discuss a nuclear-free zone in the region once comprehensive peace agreements are reached and sustained between all actors, Israel and the Arab world, Iran, the Sunni world, and any other actor you can imagine in the Middle East. So in the 90s, for the first time, we see Israel actually laying out a policy and explaining what it is. It was labeled in the press as the long corridor policy. So Israel is basically saying there should be a regional peace process that is analogous to a long corridor. Once we traverse this corridor, we'll talk about establishing a nuclear-free zone, and we will discuss how we can continue. So the policy has been revealed and disclosed in the mid-90s, and Israel decided to align with other arms control initiatives championed by the U.S. Israel joined the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, signed it, but following the U.S., it didn't ratify it. Israel will not ratify it officially before the U.S. does, but really tried to play along and to not be an obstructionist player during the 90s, an era of the U.S. being the unilateral force shaping arms control. It was very important for Israel is not to be obstructionist. They didn't limit Israel's nuclear program. So they're happy to sign the CTBT, and they were willing to sign in 93 the CWC, the Chemical Weapons Convention. So they're willing to take part in other treaties as long as they don't have to give anything relating to the nuclear program itself. These are the 90s, and I think we've been frozen in time and space since then. We saw diplomatic maneuvering, different diplomatic maneuvers come and go, but the reality hasn't changed. Israel still refuses to join the NPT before the long corridor transpires officially. Israel resents attempts by the Arab world to call a zone into existence, to establish a zone without the active participation and the consensus of Israel and other actors. So nothing came out of the WMD zone initiative, which saw some maneuvering in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Now everyone is waiting to see whether the U.S. manages to roll back the Iranian nuclear program. President Trump has made very forceful statements, but no one knows how he's planning to back them up.
This episode concludes with a look toward the future of arms control and current regional security dynamics involving Israel.
The October 7th Hamas attack took Israel by surprise, despite a few silly comments by Israeli parliamentarians Israel's nuclear forces are not relevant for this. For example, a minister called Amichai Eliyahu was the Israel Minister for Heritage, made the following comment a few days after October 7th that the nuclear option is also an option. Of course, that silliness wrapped up in stupidity. Israel's nuclear capability has zero relevance to the Gaza Strip. And another parliamentarian from the Likud party that built the coalition, where Prime Minister Netanyahu head, Tali Gottlieb, immediately after October 7th happened, she went on Twitter tweeting, "Jericho, Jericho, where are the Jericho missiles?" This just goes to underline the people that should not be in leadership positions, found themselves in leadership positions under this government. But it indicates that Israel's nuclear weapons are not relevant to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They are relevant to the Israel-Iranian conflict and whether Iran will cross the nuclear threshold and whether we're likely to see a situation where we have two nuclear actors trying to deter each other or not. And it's anyone's guess whether Iran will cross the nuclear threshold or not, and whether Israel or the US or jointly will attack or not. Israel's nuclear weapons are not relevant to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Since the mid-90s, Israel hasn't shifted its official policy. The official Israeli policy is that Israel would be willing to engage in talks about creating a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East, perhaps as a part of the wider WMD zone. In the 90s, the IEA adopted the Mubarak plan floated in 1990. Instead of a nuclear-free zone, the international community started talking about a WMD zone, so a zone which would also include a ban not only on nuclear weapons, but also on chemical and biological. Israel said that it adheres to the policy that it established in the 1990s, that it would be willing to discuss arrangements relating to the establishment of the nuclear-free zone only when sustainable peace agreements are achieved in the Middle East. Israel is not willing to participate in talks about how to establish the zone. They're willing to sit in forums just shy of that. But nothing substantial came out in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. The question is, what would happen if Iran crosses the nuclear threshold? Israel's official policy is that it would not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the region. That's the official policy. It came about in the 1960s in Israeli-US bilateral talks, and it became public, and it became the public state of the policy, even though it doesn't say much because introduction isn't a legal term. You can interpret introduction in different ways, and you can have a legal debate on what introduction means. But if and when should Iran decide to publicly go nuclear and declare itself as a nuclear actor, the policy would be nullified. Iran would be an actor that had introduced nuclear weapons to the region, and the policy would be abandoned. The question is, will we see a shift in Israel's public nuclear posture? Many scholars think that should that happen, Israel is likely to change its ambiguous nuclear posture. Instead of not directly referring to the nuclear arsenal, adhering to a vague statement, it's likely it would become more transparent with what it has. But we can imagine different scenarios. When countries want to show that they're nuclear capable, they can conduct tests, they can launch missiles, they can declare. So the question of how exactly Israel would go about reshaping its nuclear posture would be open for interpretation. The Israelis are not openly discussing this because it's deemed strategic unwise to say exactly what you're going to do should an event happen when you want to focus on that event not happening or preventing that event. The Israelis and Americans, especially now with the Trump administration, are focused on trying to roll back the Iranian nuclear program or deter the Iranians. And it seems like Trump wants to force the Iranians to accept a new nuclear deal. The problem is you can bomb a nuclear facility, but you cannot bomb nuclear knowledge. The Iranians already know how to set advanced nuclear centrifuges and how to produce highly enriched uranium. That's not going anywhere. Now, the Americans and Israelis have to figure out their next step. Another important thing to remember is that for both the Israeli and the American calculation, you have to make sure that you don't pressure Iran into crossing the nuclear threshold. That's a gentle calculus. Given the blows Iran's strategy has taken in the past year or so, more and more hawks within the Iranian administration are now calling for Iran to reconsider its nuclear policy, to consider a shift to a more avert nuclear policy. Some of them are calling Iran to consider a withdrawal from the NPT or even just to go nuclear. Whatever policy is that Israel and the US decide to pursue jointly or separately, there's always the question of how do you prevent the Iranians from making that final step? Or how do you prevent the hawks from winning the discussion? You don't want Iran to go nuclear and declare itself nuclear. So that's a gentle calculation.
Thank you for listening, and to our guest and the European Union's Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding the series. Until next time, stay optimistic.